All right, I do just kind of start this off with a disclaimer. The younglings that Tinas was referring to, that may or may not be me. So if I do slip out some Gen Z slang, that's just my bad. But today we're just going to have a discussion about just pen testing in the wonderful age of AI. It's a really tough time. It's a really chaotic time. There's a lot of opinions. There's a lot of things happening. And the aim of this is really just to have a mental model, like Tinas mentioned, right? Having a way to think about this that is actually applicable in the field. Like I mentioned, it's a chaotic industry. It's a chaotic time right now. And I think it's very important just to kind of tell you guys what perspective we're going to be coming into this from. So I've been very fortunate to be part of an early access program or tester program for an industry-backed pen testing solution or AI pen testing solution. And the one thing that I want to make kind of clear there is I've had the ability to run this real engagements, real clients, real environments, causing real chaos. And the other big thing there is that it's not just like a lot of the opinions you have online, a lot of the kind of perspectives that you have online is from people just using these tools, right? That's kind of where that ends. And the perspective I really want to focus on during this talk is the builder's perspective. I've been part of the team that builds this AI, right? Builds the methodology, builds the harness, in charge of its capability, its benchmarking, and all of that, and everything that kind of incorporates, right? So that's really the perspective I want to focus on, instead of just standing here and telling you, hey, I use this and found everything, and that's kind of it. So with that said, I do want to just start off with a little bit of a baseline. I'm sure everybody has an idea of kind of what makes scanners and AI pen testers or agentic pen testers a little bit different, but just for a little bit of a baseline. And obviously there's a lot more than just this slide, right? There's like the reasoning it has, or like how does it approach the methodology and all that. But the main point there is kind of the output. That's in essence what you eventually get out, right? So a scanner will tell you, hey, there's this endpoint vulnerable to either this CVE, or you can perform, or it's vulnerable to SQL injection, CVSS, kind of leaves you at that. But what really makes the output there different from an agentic perspective is that it'll give you that kind of the same output there, but it'll provide that extra value. It'll tell you that, hey, we found this vulnerability, this endpoint. Here's exactly how we found it. Here's the proof of concept script. Here's the business impact, and here's the remedial. Now, that kind of value that it provides, that's something you can take to developers. That's something you can take to business stakeholders to show them something, right? Not just a scan as output that you then have to go and verify and decode and then kind of write things up and then provide to stakeholders or developers. Now, to kind of kick things off a little bit from an MWR perspective, how we kind of assess this in a sense was we took a leading platform and we ran it in a lab environment. And I'm going to start with the positive things that I saw, or that we saw, is that it found vulnerabilities that would have taken weeks of manual effort, right? It found things that would have been very tedious to find, and it's that real depth and consistency at scale that impressed us. The ability to do your basic test cases across a large amount of functionality and finding those, and actually applying those test cases consistently. And that's really what kind of was the first thing that got pointed out to us, is that that's really impressive. But on the other hand is, every vulnerability that it raised in this lab environment had an ID. Those IDs went up to 21, right? And it actually only reported on 7 there. So it means that it dropped 14 findings during either manual verification or some automated triaging. That's 66% false positive rate, which is mental. And that's kind of the double-edged sword there, is that it can apply these test cases consistently. It can provide that kind of little bit of value there, but do you have the resources to actually go and manually verify some of these findings if it doesn't actually just do that verification on its own? So And that really just points something out. Even the quote unquote leading platforms, they're not even close to being perfect. They're not even close to being in a state where you can just plug them into your environment and run them and kind of leave it at that. Now, again, last reference to Tina's talk. I want to kind of build a framework with everybody here to build a way of thinking about these things so that we can understand, well, where's the benefit, right? And in the scenarios where we want to use agents, well, what's the approach we should take? So to start off with making this, we need to first understand kind of the conditions that an agent might be expected to work under. Now, the first kind of condition there is, well, for the solution, what's the technical complexity that we want? What's the technical complexity that it has to work under, right? Do we just want it to do baseline coverage, baseline security coverage, doing your OWASP top 10? Or do we want it to look for novel vulnerabilities or heavily technical vulnerabilities? And with that as well is, in what environment are we working in? Are we just going to point the AI or the agent at 3 API endpoints and leave it at that? Or is it going to be expected to work in a massive multi-web application environment and it just has to go ham in that environment and everything that comes with that, right? So understanding those first two categories there, that will help us, answering those first two categories will help us understand, firstly, understand the derived answers to those, but help us understand the approach we have to take, right? With the approach, it's how should we treat an agentic pen tester based off of the answers to those two questions, right? How should we treat an agentic pen tester when we actually want to use it and we have that business need? Then we have to understand, well, who's going to be leading the greater engagement? So we understand that, cool, it's working in this environment, this level of technical complexity. Well, here's the approach, but who's leading the greater engagement, right? I mentioned that there's that verification process, right? Who's at the end of the day taking ownership of what it puts out? So we end up adding all of that. We end up with 4 quadrants that look like this, each of them kind of touching on the four different scenarios you might have if you actually apply that mindset, right? So obviously technical environment, very technical environment, but we're looking for known vulnerabilities, technical, novel, high business context, big environments, basic coverage, all that. But that's super boring. So instead of talking about each category here, we're going to look at some war stories. Each of these actual real engagements that apply to each of these quadrants to just give you an idea of how this mindset actually applies during real engagements and how they apply on a agentic pen testing perspective. So the first one I'm going to take a look at is in a technical environment, but we're just looking for known vulnerabilities, right? This is maybe 3 API endpoints and we just want OWASP top 10 coverage. And this is generally where we just automate it. So the agent should serve as an automating factor. It doesn't really need, like we mentioned, it can apply those basic test cases. It doesn't really need someone to kind of check up on it constantly. If it can apply those basic OWASP test cases and apply them fairly well, that's just kind of where you just let the agent run wild and let it do its thing. So the little war story here is start an engagement against a very mature code base. It's an open source application. This was black box. The agent didn't have access to the code base, but very mature application. And it managed to achieve broad coverage in a very short amount of time. Again, applying basic test cases. Now, like I mentioned, applying those consistent test cases on this very mature application where there's just like layers and layers and layers of functionality that a human, it would take you a very long time just to actually get to some of these layers. And just by applying these consistent kind of test cases across everything in a very mature application, it found a very basic vulnerability that has been sitting there for upwards to 5 or 6 years. And it was just a basic authentication on forced vulnerability that exposed private containers. And what, for those that might not know what containers are, they generally might contain like quite a lot of secrets and IP. And just by applying those basic test cases, just letting it loose, within 2 hours, it found something sitting there for upwards to 5 years. But what if we start looking for novel things? What if we start looking for vulnerability, or the kind of core breakage of functionality, right? Finding vulnerabilities that actually matter, breaking the functionality itself. These aren't vulnerabilities that you find in your OWASP top 10, but breaking the actual functionality, the underlying kind of business functionality that an application gives you. Here we have to start having some say in what happens. Here's where we have to start verifying, just checking up, making sure, right? Now, agents, they struggle to find novel vulnerabilities. They struggle to find novel vulnerabilities. They have the logic for it, right? These systems are incredibly good at reasoning, incredibly good at formulating logical, I guess, answers, but very, very bad at actually applying them, right? And this is where the human has to kind of come in there, verify what it's saying, and just close that loop, right? Because it has the logic, it just can't apply it. And the example here is that I ran the agent against an application. It identified that this application has some Java sandbox interface. So this one might get a little bit technical, but just bear with me. So Java sandbox interface that it identified through the web application essentially just allows users to call some predefined Java classes from the server side. And it made a crucial mistake. It made an assumption. It made an assumption about the technology stack that was actually being enforced, or that was actually being used to kind of implement this Java sandbox. This Java sandbox interface. And that assumption kind of caused it to raise a vulnerability that it could not confirm. But it raised the vulnerability because it thought that its logic was correct, right? It raised the finding because it saw that, hey, I might not know what the technology stack is, but I believe this is a potential finding. And again, solid technical logic made a very big assumption that caused its application of that logic to be entirely flawed, giving you a proof of concept script that didn't work. So the human element here, which is kind of where we have to come in and again make sure that what it's saying actually makes sense, because most of the times it doesn't. But as from the human perspective here, you come in, actually went and identified the technology stack that was being used and adjusted the proof of concept script that to kind of fit that technology stack, to correct the assumption, to verify what it said and correct that assumption that it made. And that then again made the proof of concept work, and we ended up with a Java sandbox escape, which led to authenticated RCE. And this really goes to show that it can perform that logical reasoning, but trusting it blindly will give you proof of concept scripts that just don't work. And it is very embarrassing giving a report to someone with a proof of concept script that just doesn't work. But it's because it made that assumption. And this really drives the point that when you're sitting in these environments where you're looking for these novel findings, or it's raising novel findings and fairly complex findings, it might just be good to just take a double take on that, right? Just verify that it is actually raising these findings out of a place of logic and applicable logic. Then moving on, this is where things get a little bit rocky. It's where we're working in environments that might be either super business orientated or working in environments that are fairly large from a business perspective. This is where understanding the limitations of agents and agentic pen testing is key. This is generally where if you give it a generic prompt, you're going to get generic results, right? In these environments, there's a lot of context, so making sure that you can feed that context to it in a structured and logical way really kind of helps drive these engagements, right? We have to direct agents when we end up in these environments. They can take in a lot of information, sure, but they are still limited by how much if by their ability to kind of tie in that large amount of information, right? And to kind of close the loop there. So the kind of war story here is that we ran the agent against initially just a broad engagement against a fairly big crypto exchange platform. And this crypto exchange platform had a lot of unique things, a lot of custom business like features and stuff. And initial engagement was a broad engagement, generic prompt, and it returned nothing. Not very surprising. But then as the human, we started, or as the human team, we actually went, looked at the application, and using our logic for how would I actually prioritize the functionality in this application? How would I prioritize, as an attacker, applying that attacker mindset, how would I prioritize what functionality to test and what to test for? And based off of that, we started pointing it in different directions, right? Initial one there, focused on the crypto deposit and withdrawal functionality and no criticals. So after that one, we pointed it at the on-chain peer-to-peer transactions functionality. Again, nothing major, found some cool things, nothing major. But the second we pointed it at the real-time market data ingestion functionality, it found an unauthenticated MQTT publish finding. Now, in essence, what that means is that me, an attacker, from an unauthenticated perspective, could publish live market data updates to everybody on that application. So just for the proof of concept, when we actually reported this, we just made the price of Bitcoin $1 across the application, which may or may not have filled some orders and may or may not have lost people some money, but that is fine. So the big point I kind of want to come across with this one is, and this is generally where a lot of business need actually sits, right? You have large environments, and agents, they can take in that information. They can take in the information about the environment, but they can't reason across it. And to put that one in a little bit more perspective, that becomes a lot more blatant, their ability to not apply that large amount of context and kind of intertwine it in their thinking. That becomes a lot more blatant when we look for novel findings in high business context environments or very complex environments. Because this is generally where the human will just still has to lead, right? This is where AI starts missing things. This is where those agentic pen testing solutions that you pay a lot of money for start missing things because they can't close the loop. They can't reason across multiple applications in large environments. So to kind of run through this, we're going to take a look at this engagement from the perspective of the agent itself. So the agent logs into an IDP, or identity provider. It receives a JWT. And the example that I have up there just kind of shows just an example of the two main scopes or claims that we want to focus on for this. So the AUD claim, which is the audience claim, that is part of your RFC standard. That is the expected way for you to indicate to receiving applications, well, who is this token for? Then there was a second claim as well, the SID scope. Now this one's obviously custom. Your normal libraries won't really be looking for this unless you tell them to. Now the agent saw this and it went on its merry way. It took that JWT, went to a customer storefront, and then started pen testing the storefront. But we then at the end got the report back, nothing very bad. But it raised during its recon, it mentioned that it saw a employee back office. And what we as the actual human pen testers then went and did, because it raised like nothing across this massive environment, there's like no way that it raised the few informationals. So went and took a look, and it turns out that those applications don't prioritize the audience claim. They prioritize that SID scope, which was always set to a wildcard operator, which means that using that token from just a normal user that wants to go to the e-commerce app, any normal user could perform authenticated actions against the back office app because they broke from that RFC. And it's quite interesting that the agent had all the information it needed to perform this test case, but chose to simply ignore it. Didn't perform this test case at all, and that led to it kind of missing this fairly horrendous vulnerability. And that's just kind of the point of this one there is, when you work with these when you work with larger environments, it can have all the information it needs, but it can't reason to that level where it can tie in these different information sources to generate new test cases that make sense. And with all of that, it's nice to have the little framework, but to put it in like applicable terms, if we have a business need, well, there's a few questions we can ask, right? First of all, in which quadrant does our business need actually lie in? Where does this business need sit? Or do we just want a few API tests in a fairly small environment? Or do we, like we said in the previous example, do we need it to perform a broad pen test across multiple web applications? Because that will tell you, right, kind of what the approaches you have to take here. Second question there is, which quadrant does the agent actually claim to operate in? A lot of solutions out there, they will tell you that they can do everything and absolutely anything. That's generally just a sales pitch, they can't. But which quadrant does the agent claim to work in? Which quadrant does your solution actually work in efficiently? And that ties into the third point there. Does it fit that human workflow? If your quadrant, like we saw, lies in any of those three top quadrants, there's going to be some human interaction. Does the solution, right, does your agentic approach actually cater towards that specific kind of approach? Does it fit a human-led workflow? Because at the end of the day, we can't just say that the agent is responsible for the output that it gives. It will always fall on someone. It will always fall on a human. And then number 4 there, does it actually provide that value? Does it actually go a step further? And does it provide that extra value? Does it give you something that you can take to stakeholders? Does it give you some form of output that allows you to understand the business need, right? Or the business impact? Does it give you a remedial that makes sense and is applied to the context and maybe technology that your application is running? It's more about just, does it give you something you can take to developers? Does it make their life easier? Or do you still have to go and struggle to actually understand these reports and then to kind of move from there? But the ground is moving, and the ground is moving very fast. Things are changing very fast. I'm obviously not a super AI expert on these things. I've had the opportunity to get a lot deeper than a lot of normal people can actually go, to get a bit of a better understanding on how these things work fundamentally and where they fall short. But things are moving very fast. Things are changing very fast. So the approaches that we saw for those different quadrants might change in the next 3 years, but the concept still stays the same. Identifying where that business need is. What is the environment? What are we actually looking for? And then just based off of where we are at that point in time, just adjusting the approach we take. I do want to then close off with a not overlords, with a quote from the creator of Burp Suite there that says, "It's not a revolution that actually tries to eliminate us as pen testers. If used properly, it's an evolution that allows us to work smarter, better, and faster, and with much greater precision." And with that, thank you. Before any questions, I will call on my PR manager just to